First of all, I have to thank you everyone for staying behind and coming to this masterclass today. And we have to thank the support of British Council for making this event possible. And I welcome and thank Mr. Greenaway for coming to our masterclass today on his birthday. Actually, today is Mr. Greenaway's birthday. Happy birthday, Mr. Greenaway. Let me start the first question. I have a few questions that I have been wondering. And you mentioned at the beginning that you think that Sergei Eisenstein is perhaps the most important filmmaker that the cinema has ever seen. But in trying to make a film about Sergei Eisenstein, why do you choose to make a film about his private life rather than his enthusiasm or his technical side in film language or in the development of filmmaking?
Well, I've always thought maybe the greatest way to celebrate this extraordinary film director is to observe his language, his theory of montage, his extraordinary ability as an editor. And you can see this film is highly, highly artificially edited. We now, in 2015, have brand new digital language to play with, which of course Eisenstein never did. So we can organize and rearrange our picture making and control it in a way that he certainly could. And the great tragedy, of course, of his attempt to try and make a film in Mexico, although he shot a huge amount of footage, he was never allowed to edit it. And that, I suppose, is in a curious way, without any, I suppose, association of lèse-majesté, not wishing to be able to compete with the extraordinary brilliance of this man. At least it's a homage in that direction. So, in answer to your question, the film itself, I think, is complementary to the way he thought, the way he organized his picture making. And obviously, as you can see, he was an extraordinary articulate and vociferous man, always talking, with 1,000 ideas and 1,000,000 opinions. So I think that that's very much part and parcel of his language. But we have a tendency, don't we, now in the 21st century, certainly, I suppose in Europe, but I suspect all over the world, to try and, I suppose, treat ordinary mortals as though they were sort of a godlike phenomenon. I've recently made a whole series of films about very, very important painters, for example, like Rembrandt and like Da Vinci. And we just made a film about a brilliant filmmaker called Goltzius, and I've made films about Mozart, etc. And there's always this danger of removing ourselves from the ability to realize that however much we admire and respect these people, they are human. They are human. And they are up against all the desires, all the successes and failures, attempts, I suppose, to be unhappy and dissatisfied. And it was the human side which I was very much keen to present here. As I said before in the prologue, this is a film very much, of course, and I'm sure you, now you've seen it, can agree, is about sex and death, eros and thanatos, which affects every single person in this audience. I know nothing about the people in the audience. I know you live in Hong Kong. I know you must be keen filmmakers, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But the only two things I know about you is two people made love to make you all. And I'm very sorry, ladies and gentlemen, you're all going to die. These are the non-negotiables. In the 21st century, I suppose we have a certain ability to live longer. And there's a way now, I suppose, generally feeling there is a new sexual permissiveness traveling the world, even though it's still very sensitive and highly problematical. And we do have freedoms, certainly, I suppose, and I have to speak very Eurocentrically here, to be able to choose our sexual partners in a way that our parents and grandparents were never able to do. But we built those things in to, I suppose, to explain also his, Eisenstein's industry and his use of imagery. And if you take the 6 extraordinary films he made, 3 at the beginning of his career when he was still in his 20s, indeed, as the film suggests, Strike, Battleship Potemkin, and October. And if you've seen his last 3 films, which are Alexander Nevsky, Ivan the Terrible, and The Boy's Plot, you will see a very interesting change. The first films are very much about that impossible phrase, dialectical materialism. I've never understood what that meant, and I don't suppose the Russians. It's a bit like that contemporary word postmodernism. You can make it mean anything you want to. But the first films are very much about ideas. They're very much about group movements, about people en masse. Certainly, I suppose, reflected Lenin's idea, and certainly Stalin's idea, of cinema as propaganda. But I think, like all great artists, like, for example, Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel was an extraordinary piece of propaganda for the Catholic Church. But if you have sufficient intelligence, I suppose, and understanding of what you're doing, propaganda falls away and you end up with extraordinary, amazing works of art. Great art is always great propaganda for great life. So I think that we ought to, in a sense also, I don't know about here in Hong Kong, but Eisenstein is extremely revered, certainly in Russia. You almost can't touch him. And I rather think I've got myself in great trouble because, as you probably know, Russia is homophobic, or at least Putin is, even if the citizens of St. Petersburg and Moscow are not. But it is rather curious, isn't it? You know, I suppose there's that phrase, if it itches, you have to scratch it. But last week, I found out that we were, in fact, invited to the Moscow Film Festival. I ought to say, too, that what we want to do is we want to make a trilogy of films. We want to make 3 films. It so happened that we've made the last chronologically, because this film happens in 1931. But we want to make a film about Eisenstein actually in Hollywood and what happened to him there in 1930. And we want to make a film of where he was in 1929, which is, and I think I can say this with association, because we're all now part of a film festival. But Eisenstein took part in the very, very first film festival in the world, which happened in a place called Las Arras in Switzerland. And there was an opportunity, I think, to debate what we're still debating, and will never, I'm sure, find an answer for. Is, in fact, cinema entertainment, or is it, in fact, an art form? My personal opinion is that, for what it's worth, that it has to be both, otherwise it will not survive. But I do sincerely believe that there are ways and means that cinema is changing so rapidly now. Sometimes, maybe in a melancholy moment, I would almost say that cinema has so changed, it's so different from the films, should we say, of the 1930s, and the attitudes of audiences in terms of social politics and attitudes to aesthetics, and certainly the technology has so changed, that the cinema we're making now, which is really much more related to the television screen in your front room and is associated with social media, is becoming very, very different from the cinema we knew in the past. And I'd like to make this film, I suppose, as I think film is changing, and let me repeat again, I think to a certain extent classic cinema is now dying, if not already dead. It's an absolutely ideal time to celebrate who I believe is certainly the greatest filmmaker we've seen.
Okay, after watching the film, I must admit that I'm more interested in your visual style of treating the subject instead of Mr. Eisenstein. And I spotted a lot of references to different films and directors from the past, like Jean Renoir, or Abu Gance, or Jean-Luc Godard, or Stanley Kubrick to some extent.
You can go on.
Yeah, I can go on forever.
And that last section is obviously a homage to, for me, the greatest film that's probably been made in the cinema, but not in association with Eisenstein, which is Last Year in Marienbad by René. I actually replay that Game of the Forks on the table. But you know, John Donne, the famous English poet, said, "No man is an island." And I would argue, no film can be an island. And constantly we make cinema, we're quoting and we're belonging, all of us, I think, to that huge club that stretches all the way back to 1895. It's a bit like our language, you know, when an Englishman like myself opens my mouth to speak, you can be pretty certain I'm quoting Shakespeare without even knowing it. And all the advertising activities and all the video and all the constant references we have in our visual life, you may be pretty certain is highly referential to what has gone before in terms of visual language. So again, and I suppose you could realize this is very much a film about filmmaking, isn't it? Constantly over and over again, I keep reminding, I would like to think, audiences that here we're watching a film about filmmaking.
Yes, but what I want to ask is, to a certain extent, I can say that you are quite restrained comparatively to your previous works in how you use your visual elements, like the text on images that you used before.
How can you say that? This film, I mean, just look at the architecture, for example. There are great palimpsests of how to use architecture in the cinema.
Use this one. That one's not.
I mean, there's a line where Eisenstein says, "All architects love cinema." I have conversations with Geary and Liebeskind, and right back to people in the early days of filmmaking. There's a particular correspondence with the notion that cinema can explain space in an incredibly successful way. And of course, architecture all about space. And then think about the sort of picture making. We've already talked about references, not just to cinema, but to a history of painting, which goes back to the Renaissance. And a continual quotation, a sort of use of multi-languages, which I think is legitimate in Eisenstein's personal history. He spoke 8 languages and he spoke them extremely well. And there is a way, I suppose, we are not only talking about the languages of cinema per se, but we're talking about all the language which are related to the digital revolution, and even more so, all the language which we can now manipulate in the year 2015.
But let's go back to my question. The most important point is, I want to stress, is how symmetrical the whole thing is. Because in the past, you have always been concerned with the shot composition, how symmetrical your shot composition is. It has always been your signature. But for this film, even the structure of the whole film is told symmetrically, like you can see when he comes to Mexico at the beginning, and then he vomits, and then he bangs the doors. Everything is symmetrical in the whole structure. Why is that so important to you?
Well, you're absolutely right. I'm trained as a painter. I think the uses of Apollonian, let's use some pompous words, the notion for order, which I think all civilizations move towards, is constantly supported by the notion of the grid, horizontals versus verticals. If you look again, and I have to use Eurocentric terms here, but if you look at Greek and Roman architecture, which is still practiced, I even notice in the shopping malls out here, it's still alive and well, even in Hong Kong, it's created a continuum. And I want to be always aware of those associations. There is, I think, an absurdist notion that cinema is considered to be the 7th art. I don't think cinema deserves it. I don't think cinema has been going long enough to create its own autonomous, species-driven art form. It's still too reliant upon all the other 6 art forms. But there's a conscious acknowledgement, indeed, of what's gone before, and Apollonian symmetry is part of that. And you're absolutely right. Our eyes can easily recognize symmetry. The left-hand side of the picture mirroring the right-hand side, the top of the frame balancing the bottom of the frame. But it's much more difficult for us to remember and understand symmetry of time. And if you were to take out a stopwatch, or if you were to count the frames, you would really find, indeed, that the beginning of this film echoes the ending. And perhaps the most important part of the whole film, should we say, bringing together maybe ironic, sardonic notions of the fundamentalism of the Russian Revolution, when that red flag is pasted into the anus of Eisenstein, you're exactly in the middle of the film.
In the past year, you have made a film called 3x3D, actually 1/3 of the film. And that is your experiment with 3D, this new medium to cinema. I wonder, why didn't you continue to make a 3D film for Eisenstein in Guanajuato? Have you been disappointed about the medium, or
no,
is it?
I think that 3D is just a local gimmick. It's disappeared. You know, once I've done that 3 times in your face, I've used up the vocabulary. There are variations on a theme, but can you really think of a good use of the grammar and syntax of cinema in association with 3D? I think it's almost impossible. I think it's been, you know, a local fillip, I suppose, association very much with Hollywood cinema, trying to reclaim the ground it has lost with the digital revolution, and also trying to lure people back into cinemas. You know, 3D is pretty useless on small screens, and you have this really uncomfortable phenomenon of having to wear glasses all the time. And there's every evidence, I think, aesthetically and certainly economically, that is a fad that's already passed. It's certainly passed in Europe. So I think it's very, very limited. But you can see, I suppose, if you've seen some of my previous films, and certainly here, there are other ways to organize notions of three-dimensionality. And you've mentioned, of course, a key figure, which is Abel Gance, which way back in the mid-1930s tried very hard with multiple screens to give you that sort of cubist notion of ubiquity. You can put the past, the present, and the future all in one plane. You can put the wide shot, the medium shot, the close-up all in one plane. You can use repetition, rather like a musical score, to make emphasis, to make repetitive points, to make quotients, to bring together also, I suppose, very much in this film, a whole documentary tradition in association with the notion, indeed, of feature film drama. Though I think nowadays the documentary is becoming so fictionalized, and in some senses the cinema is becoming so documentaryized, that in a curious way these definitions, these, I suppose, journalistic tropes are ceasing to be valuable anymore. And I would say 3 cheers for that.
As we have only about 5 minutes left, I think I'll open to the audience to ask you questions, okay? Anyone raise your hands? You can ask Mr. Greenaway a question. Yes.
Hello. Music seems to be an important part in your movie. I want to know what's your attitude of music and the film. And the second question is, in the past, you have cooperated with Michael Newman. Oh, sorry. In the past, you cooperated with Michael Newman, and at least 4 films in my memory. What's the opinion about his work?
Well, if I can maybe answer perhaps both of your questions at the same time. I've always thought that film is very badly used in cinema. It's used as decoration, it's used for emphasis, persuading you, the audience, how to think. But I think that music in the cinema has a long history. Of course, you can make films without music, and many French filmmakers in the 30s and 40s did. But I always think that cinema without music is somehow impoverished. So it's, in a curious way, a marriage made in heaven and should be exploited. But I want to use music in a very structural way. And often I write scripts were much more like, I suppose, ideas of musical scores rather than literary events. And you notice my language constantly uses repetition and takes a thematic material, if you like, and gets it played by the violins, and then moves the same material with variations on a theme into the woodwind section. It's generally believed, I suppose, in certainly commercial orthodox cinema, that repetitions are bad. But I think, it's part of a visual language which is very, very common in painting and should be also brought to bear in conditions of cinema. And here we have the music of Prokofiev. And you might know that Prokofiev and Eisenstein were great collaborators. And they did some really serious experiments along the lines that I'm trying to explain to you now, about trying to make both the composer and the film director equal partners. You know what normally happens. The pictures take primacy, and then maybe halfway through the film manufacturer, the studio, the director start making a contact with the music people. So the music is always inevitably an adjunct that comes afterwards. And I think that's a desperate way to misunderstand how to use music. So if you know the film Alexander Nevsky, which is the classic Prokofiev-Eisenstein collaboration, it goes, I don't know whether it can be absolutely proven, it's very difficult, of course, to be working these things out in hindsight, but Prokofiev refused to write a single note of music, and Eisenstein refused to make a single frame until they'd come to an agreement about how indeed, theoretically, the uses of music and image could be brought together. And Michael Nyman and I were fascinated, this is many, many years ago, in the early 1960s, about indeed this film, and we examined it very closely, and we tried to put together a collaboration that used it as an example, an example. The first film we made along these lines was a movie you might have seen, which in English is called The Draftsman's Contract, which again tries to make that balance between these two media satisfactory in a cinema context. Such are the vagaries of filmmaking, and under all the pressures, of course, the opportunity to be able to conduct these sorts of experiments are often surrounded by all sorts of difficulties. But it's always indeed my admiration for that Prokofiev-Eisenstein collaboration, which we in a sense homage here again, we bring it all back, is related to those early experiments. And you're right, I think Michael and I made about 6 feature films and about 20 other films in an association, I suppose you could call Michael Nyman, a late 1960s New York minimalist. And I don't think there's been any big revolution in musical activity in a classical field since minimalism, and we are now presented with 2nd generation, 3rd generation, 4th generation minimalists. They're still practicing around the world, and I've worked with a great deal of them. I think that probably the last time Michael Nyman and I worked was on a film based upon Shakespeare's play The Tempest, called Prospero's Books, and we've both gone in completely different directions since then, which is certainly rewarding for me because it's opened up horizons and I've worked from extraordinary people. But often we go back, like next year, for example, the Western world is going to celebrate the painter Hieronymus Bosch, and Philip Glass and I are making an opera simply called Bosch, indeed about that extraordinary painting, to celebrate in memoriam Bosch's death, which was 500 years next year. So the continuum, moves forward. But I am always fascinated by trying to make new musical approaches. But at the heart of all this question, and I think the question you've asked is very relevant, we really have to find a satisfactory way to make both the music and the image making in cinema equal partners.
Okay, I can allow one more question only. Anyone? Yes, over there. Up there.
Just while we're waiting for the question, you can see the tenor of the things we're being discussed. we could certainly spend 3 hours here talking about the ways and means. I suppose what I would like to proselytize is the notion of cinema, because I think, you know, most cinema has become extremely moribund and irrelevant to our lives and our conditions of aesthetics, and it certainly hasn't really approached the fantastic languages of the digital revolution. It uses digital processes, but basically to put old wine in new bottles. And what we need to do is to put new wine in new bottles to really be able, as you see some of the activities in this film, which are really exploring things which are no longer related, I don't think, to celluloid cinema, but to new ways and means, indeed, of organizing our sense of visual literacy.
Okay, thank you. So it's my honor to ask you the question. Actually, I've been watching like a few years about your movie. Every time in the hkiff, and I'm very interested about how do you find the how to say, because every time I watch your movie, I know that there's a very great structure behind, and it's really fascinating. And I find out that everything your work is perfect. So most of the time I don't really, somehow I don't really understand, and I have to back to research after watching your movie. But I'm very interested about how do you select the topics of your movie or the schedule about your plan, because as you are a director, and you spend like maybe most of your time, and it must be your love and the life of making movie for yourself. So I'm very interested about like how do you schedule, or how do you
Well, I think there's a really, being very simplistic, a very simple answer. I'm trained as a painter. There is a way that I prize the ability to communicate in visual means. And I always feel deeply disenchanted by cinema, because cinema is a text-based medium. Cinema is really about text. Nobody in this room has seen a film which did not start life as a text. And I think that's a great tragedy. Text has so many media to concern itself with. Take the theatre, for example, that always hands down its meaning in text, certainly in European terms, in Western terms. And there's been, 5,000 years, probably here in China, 8,000 years of a lyrical, poetic tradition of text making. Why can't we have a media, cinema, ideally, which just concentrates on the purveyance of visual literacy as opposed to the notion of text, text, text? So we have a cinema which is deeply based to the bookshop. I think that's a great tragedy, and we should try very, very hard to remove that. There is that phrase, though, isn't there, in English, unless you can prove it's broken, nobody's going to try and mend it. I have, I suppose, quite some provocative ideas, and I think, again, recalling the name of Abel Gance, why do we all sit here in the dark? You are not nocturnal animals, you're diurnal animals, and why are you sitting, and why are you only looking in one direction? If you look in one direction, it means 2/3 of the world is behind your head. Just think of how much you are losing. And in a sense, because you're forced to sit for, 120 minutes now, there's a feeling your whole physicality is denied. I even think places like this have held cinema back. Cinema architecture has held cinema back. And and if you've glimpsed, even from a Disney point of view, of the possibilities of the notions of future cinematic visual literacy, you realize we've only barely scratched the surface of what's possible. But although I think I'm very pessimistic, I think about the celluloid cinema we've had for the last 120 years, I am very optimistic about what happens next, because I do think, Microsoft invents a new tool for us every afternoon, and if you're a really sensible artist, you will always use the technology of your time. Leonardo da Vinci did, Rembrandt did, Vermeer did. It's a characteristic. If you start continually using the tools of the past, you just become a fossil in a museum. So you must grapple with the current language, and make a communication with that. Sorry, this is a long answer, but your question was quite long too, wasn't it? So I think probably I suppose in a journal quick answer, I think it's the tenets and the vocabulary and the success of painting, both East and West, certainly for the last 3,000 years, which for me is always at the base of what we're trying to do. I suppose also, just to give you another glib answer, several years ago, an Italian journalist asked me, Mr. Greenaway, you started life as a painter, and now you are a filmmaker. Why is that? And I said, I suppose rather glibly, that I was always disappointed that paintings did not have soundtracks.
Okay, I think that's a great note to end this masterclass. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm sure Mr. Greenaway will be happy to meet you all out there if you have any more questions.
Okay, great, thank you.